Welcome to the Grow to Amazing podcast, episode number 6. I am Tony Mays, your host, and I am very excited today to have on the podcast a USA Today bestselling author. His name is Mike Rothman, and he has, I believe it's 15 books altogether published with a few more coming out in the pipeline. And just happy to have him on to be able to talk about his writing history, how he got into it, how he balances work, life, and writing, because he is still working full-time and writing as a very successful writer and has kids and a wife as well. So I think it's going to be a great discussion, and hope you like it as well, and hope you get something out of it to help you grow through your life. Enjoy. I'd like to welcome Mike Rothman to the Grow to Amazing podcast. This is episode number 6, and I'm really happy to have him on here. I'll just take right from your bio, Mike, then we'll go from there. So thanks for coming on today. Really appreciate it.
Sure, no problem.
Mike is a USA Today bestselling author, one of the most unlikely novelists you'll ever meet. He's an engineer, first and foremost, background in the sciences, and somehow or another, you turned a writing habit into just a lot more than I'd say than a run-of-the-mill hobby. You write stories that focus on two things: technology and international intrigue. You tend to span a lot of the genres of science fiction, techno-thriller, and mainstream thrillers. You've also got some fantasy out there, I think, as well, and kind of blend that fantasy in there, kind of blur the lines there a little. You enjoy cooking, which I've got a story I want to read about that eventually, learning about new tech, travel, and spending time with his family. So firstborn American in your family, despises self-importance, and I think I've sensed a touch of sarcasm in your posts online as well. So
Yeah.
and you still love reading, engineer, scientists, and things like that. Welcome to the podcast again. So
Thank you.
you want to, I guess I kind of like to start a little bit about on the history side of things. And you mentioned in your bio, firstborn American in your family. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Sure. So like I said, yeah, the firstborn in my family, born in Connecticut long ago, and yeah, most of my family came to the U.S. in mid '50s. Yeah, it was after World War II era. Grandfather was refugee from the Nazis. Most of my family is I would say more than half of my family still lives in Israel, and and we're scattered a little bit in Europe, but a lot of them are in Israel.
Did I hear you were an Army brat as well?
Oh yeah,
Somewhere? Okay.
My father came over to U.S. When he was a teen, and somewhere along the way joined Air Force first, was a test pilot, and then joined the Army. I came along during the Army stint.
Oh, okay.
And
How many years was he in altogether?
I think he did his 20.
Okay.
For the Army. Yeah, he was a physician. There. So
Excellent. So did your grandfather, was he actually in a concentration camp or where
no,
did
he managed to escape. Most of that generation passed. So they died in the concentration camps. He and his mother was a survivor of Birkenau. And let's see, and I think his sister survived, and that was about it. He was a refugee. So he was 13 at the time when that was happening, and got smuggled onto a freighter and managed to So he had lots of stories, but one of them was on the freighter, a whole bunch of refugees just like him. Packed like sardines, and he chose the U.S. to bring the family over versus U.K. or anywhere else, was because he had very vivid memories of, as the freighter was approaching the coasts of at the time was a UK territory. The freighter, which was full of just refugees, was being machine gunned from the shore by
from the
British
UK
troops.
shore? Wow.
Yeah. So
that would probably be a little bit of a disincentive to get off the boat there.
So he held a little resentment from that,
Yeah.
and and never went there. But,
Yeah.
when he came to the U.S. and he was very much and I guess this is what instilled it in my father, and me as well. He was very much a patriot in as much as I mean he served in the army when he was in Israel. It was sort of the thing to do.
I think
Uh,
everybody pretty much did back then, right?
yeah,
So
yeah.
that must have been around the formation of the state, I'm
Oh
guessing.
yeah, absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And but bought America. He was very big on buying American, and just he would never buy anything if he could avoid it that was built or made elsewhere.
So that must have shaped probably your father's growing up quite a bit as well, growing up with his dad in the army and then they're in the military and
Yeah, I mean because for the most part, my grandfather growing up the way he did, it was pull yourself up by your bootstraps or die.
yeah.
And that you know it's more complicated than that. But in essence, I mean, I really did grow up, at the knee of my grandfather versus my father. My father was in med school when I was young, et
Mm-hmm.
cetera, and in the army, and we traveled a lot. But
Mm-hmm.
I learned a lot of lessons with regards to self-reliance and not depending on anything. And one of the reasons, I mean, my grandfather, even though obviously he was a refugee and was penniless at the time,
Mm-hmm.
built himself a pretty decent series of businesses, but
Good.
refused to pay for school, refused to I mean, so it was a
You had to bootstrap yourself basically. Yeah.
right, because
Mm-hmm.
he did it, it grows character or whatever. I mean, now I'm paying for my kids' college, but whatever.
Yeah.
It's those were lessons he chose to impart to
Yeah.
his son, and and I experienced some similar things.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I can empathize with that too. I mean, my parents, um, I was on my own for college as well, and kind of took the wrong path of a few student loans and things like that. And if you can avoid that with your kids, that's great. I mean, as long as they're learning the lessons to go along with that about managing their money and things like that.
No, right,
Yeah,
and there's slightly different situations for them
sure.
and for
Yeah,
me. Because my grandfather probably I think was still building his business, and my father's situation for me was, I mean, I think he was directly affected by my grandfather's lessons, so
yeah,
I was on my own, but he could have afforded anything, and
yeah.
that wasn't an issue. So I didn't do what my father did, in as much as um,
And that's
I,
okay, right?
I can afford to college and
Yeah.
everything else, so I'm paying for it. However, at the same time, the kids know that their job is grades and whatnot, and if they don't, they're going to be flipping
And they
burgers
figure it out
somewhere.
themselves. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and
yeah.
on their own. So you can choose to ruin your life or not. That's up to you. It's like
Hmm.
especially if you have aspirations that require a degree and you
Yeah.
screw up, there are consequences to all actions. So.
Yep, absolutely. I've got an 18-year-old that is doing, I don't know, rightly or wrongly, but had been pushing him for a 4-year school and he'd been pushing back and wanting to do, he was very big on music, was talking about a performance degree, but then he also got into music instrument repair and decided that's what he wanted. But he's really flourished in that program. And now I wouldn't change it for the world. And I'm glad that
Right.
he stuck to his guns on what his dream was. So, yeah.
No, I mean it's been said, if you do, what you like, you never have to work a day in your life.
Hmm.
So
Yep.
to me, it's follow your talents versus. Yeah, I think a lot of parents are encourage delusions potentially. It's like, well, I'm going to be a rock star
Yeah.
potentially, and you know that the kid can't sing, can't play guitar, I'm like, all right, your chances are 0%, but I'll encourage it.
Hmm.
No, I'm not going to encourage something that I know you're not capable of
Yeah.
doing.
Yeah.
But kids are flexible, so they can. Yeah,
Yep. Yep. So,
my kids are smart, so they can do it.
yeah. Yep. So did that, when did you start getting into science and technology and things like that?
Uh, so
Was that
science from
always?
the
Yeah.
yeah, so science has always been a thing for me. So my degrees are in science, physics, and actually biology, oddly enough. So it's always been. I mean, it's my career, my job one career, and so I've been a research scientist for 30 plus years. So, and so that's been part of it. And
Hmm.
I guess as a tangent, the writing, so most of the folks at my work, if they, and actually inevitably, as I sold more, I learned some people figured out that I was writing because it was never something I actually was open about. And I keep a very hard line between author persona and other persona. Yeah, I don't cross those streams. However, inevitably, some people that I worked with go, "Hey, do you by chance write novels or whatever?" And I was like, "Oh no." But that all started actually from my kids, oddly enough, because
Sure.
it was the whole bedtime story thing, and
Okay.
even though I didn't necessarily see myself as a writer ever, because it was never something I was interested in.
Do you write articles for work though?
Oh yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, I've
You
got
publish?
whether it's research papers,
Sure.
patents, et cetera, et cetera. Those are all things that I do. So I always wrote as part of my job, but it was never a creative writing thing per se.
Sure.
Though obviously the patent thing has to be, but it's not the same thing. When I started dabbling with the writing, it had nothing to do with what I do today. It really had to do with entertaining my kids for bedtime stories, and for me to keep the stories straight in my head, because I was making it up on the fly. I started writing
Yep.
it down, and then eventually I started writing it down, and the story got more complex and longer. So I started writing longhand. What inevitably ended up being, a handful of novels. And along the way, I mean, I knew of, and anytime I invest any time in I do research. So
Okay.
it's
You just
just
can't
part.
help yourself, kind of a thing.
It's part
Yeah.
of my DNA. I can't
Yeah.
help it. So I got to know some writer, I mean, because I was always a reader, thrillers, like Crichton, but also epic fantasy was something, especially as a kid and growing up.
What were
I
kind of
mean,
your top 5 authors, or if you can pick
so
5 or a couple?
yeah. So I mean, I was a big fan of Tolkien, Eddings, Isaac Asimov, from a sci-fi side of the world, Crichton, Grisham, Cussler. So I kind of spanned the thriller slash sci-fi slash epic fantasy kind of genres. For me, I just inevitably, after I wrote down these things that I fully intended to keep in the desk forever, as historical artifacts, I found myself talking to a couple of New York Times type authors, and and we were talking, and I shared with one of them one of my old things that I scrubbed it to the best of my abilities, and it wasn't something I was ever planning on doing, but he asked to take a look at it. His advice was essentially, it's like, is this the kind of stuff you want to do? I was like, not really, because all right, put it this way, I'm the stuffy professor type, so I'm not
Sure.
about to go ahead and start writing about dragons and dwarves, or and admit that I'd talk about it in public ever. I've gotten over that, but certainly when I started writing a handful of years ago in earnest, I was like, no, because I showed him one of the kids bedtime stories essentially.
So even with the kid stories, were you on like the scientific kind of bent a little bit, or was it more
Uh,
of a fantasy type thing?
their thing was definitely an epic fantasy.
Sure. Okay.
So it was definitely along those lines. But I mixed. I did mix. It was all about initially a family. So I put the kids into the story. So
Gotcha.
was part of the entertainment for them, is that it was, imagine, we were on a vacation and we end up in a new planet or whatever, and you
Sure.
go from there. So it was the entire family, as far as they were concerned, on an adventure. So that was the bedtime story, and it evolved from there. So, which was kind of a mix of science-ish thing, because hey, if dad's the scientist person, well, of course I'm going to be doing science stuff in this new world.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they're going to be heroes and hacking and slashing and whatever. So,
Nice. Okay. So getting
but
back to, yeah, you mentioned you had shared a little bit with an author that
yeah,
you got to know.
they gave me advice, and actually I got the same kind of advice from multiple of them, which was essentially do, if this isn't what I wanted to do, it's like, do what I know. And I started going, oh, I'll do what I know. What
Okay.
do I know?
Yeah.
Science. I do know science, and I enjoy thrillers, and that's where I started dabbling. I've got an advantage in as much as I've got a good career, and
Hmm.
I oftentimes say I can't afford the time to do things, but I can afford to hire someone to do something for me,
Okay.
to help me out. So what I ended up doing, my bootstrap of, because I was willing to do the work, but
Hmm.
oftentimes, like when you're doing work and you don't know what you're doing, it's like bring
Hmm.
me a rock. It's like, well, I know this kind of was okay, but sucked,
Yeah.
so, but I don't know how to fix it,
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
or I don't have the perspective. So you need somebody else. And I wasn't about to go ask a friend or anything else because I was kind of on the down low with regards to any author thing. So I asked around, from some of the folks I knew, and and found kind of like top notch editor who used to be like publisher or editor in chief for like one of the trad pubs, who had
Okay.
recently retired. And I was
Okay.
like, hey Betsy, I need some help.
Hmm.
And obviously with enough money, help came in the form of editing. she
Yep.
she
Yep.
basically edited some of the stuff that I had done, and I used that as a means for me to learn what was I screwing up. Because for me it was all about the story was never a problem. I could always
Hmm.
come up with a story, and I luckily, people often ask me, well, how do you come up with the ideas for the stories? That one's either a God given thing or whatnot. I had a instinct for telling a
Hmm.
story,
Hmm.
but what I knew I was shaky on was the mechanics of it. What was I missing in my story? I mean, the overall arc of a story, no problem. I can come up
Hmm.
with that. But where I was, where I thought I was weak, and and I was to a great extent, was making it smooth, making it,
Hmm.
like, I mean, one of the simplest things you can do is read the story aloud the way you've written it. And if it doesn't sound right, it's not right.
Hmm.
So, you should be able to read it and it just flows naturally. It doesn't sound awkward. It
Hmm.
makes sense.
Hmm.
And oftentimes that test, I wouldn't pass it, so I'm like, okay, well, clearly that paragraph's all messed up. Let me start fixing it. And the more
Sure.
you do it, I mean, it's the old adage of 10,000 hours. It's like, once you put 10,000 hours in, you're sort of getting better at, you start to know what you're doing. There's nothing that beats sweat equity when it comes to writing, because you just got
Sure.
to put the
Sure.
time in. It helps a lot when you have a really qualified, competent person evaluating it, like an editor. And the one thing I guess I advise is there are a lot of people who put up their shingle and say I'm an editor, and that was the thing that worried me is, if I'm gonna
Hmm.
spend the time to try to learn how to do this stuff, I don't want to be jerked around. I
Yeah.
don't want to, bring me a rock because I'm getting bad advice.
Yeah, I
I don't
mean,
want
there's
to
a lot of
learn the wrong
companies
way.
that will say, "Pay us $5,000 and we'll publish your book" or something like that, and
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, that kind of thing. So,
They're not helping you. And another lesson I learned, certainly starting off, is, because what the way I use those edits, I mean, and I've heard some people, it's like, oh, I send it off to the editor, they fix whatever is wrong, and I just publish as is. I was like, well, do you even look at it? It's like, well, I kind of skim it. Yeah, I was like, yeah, that's, to
mm,
me, for me, and it's always going to come back to what worked for me personally.
yeah.
But for
So you
me,
use
what
it,
I,
you use it as more of a back and forth type discussion
yeah,
or something like that.
well,
So,
well, well, well I actually forced myself to. I took the editor's marked up version, and I
mhm.
took my original, and I longhand in gross detail, um, went paragraph by paragraph, and started copying in her changes, going, do I agree, do I not agree, why
Mhm.
did she do that, does it make sense? And most of it, I would say, and an editor isn't going to be 100%, even
Mhm.
the best,
Well, and
But
they might miss your intent of a certain passage or something like that, or
sure,
whatever.
sure.
Yeah.
Sure, and the thing for me was because a lot of mine was the mechanics. I didn't see the problems where just a simple example of a problem. The editor would call it an echo. Where I use the same word 3 times in 3 paragraphs or something. Where
Okay.
in the paragraph by itself it looks fine, and the next paragraph by itself looks fine, but when you start reading it together, you're like, yeah, I keep saying that same damn word. Why am I doing that? It's a crutch word essentially. So helping me identify crutch words and being sensitive to it, those are all little things. Yes, I call writing like the peeling of an onion. It's like you learn a lesson, there's another lesson to learn after that.
Well, I
So
saw on your website you also had like a 0 to 5 scale for indie publishers for the quality of their work and things like that.
yeah. And the thing is, we all go through this self-delusion. It's like, like when I wrote the stuff that I handed to that first author friend of mine to take a look at,
Hmm.
as far as I was concerned, it looked great. But
Hmm.
I knew, I mean, I knew it would be delusional. I mean, either I'm a genius because I've never had a creative writing class in my life and know nothing about it. Either I'm a
Yep.
genius and it's all natural, which I didn't believe, or
Hmm.
I'm like, okay, someone needs to give me a clue, hit me with a clue bat because I don't know. It looks fine to me. So you're always going to have these levels of self-delusion, and most people never get past that first level of, well, it looks good to me. I think it's good,
Yeah.
and it's not, and it's
Then they
not.
go out to KDP and just publish it, and
Right, and
yeah,
and 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 that's the unfortunate thing with, and this is not to denigrate anybody, because we all go through these learning processes, but and your mileage will vary. I mean, some people are naturally much better writers than I am. I would never have, and still don't categorize myself as the best writer out there, by far. But at least I'm now at the stage. I mean, I think I recently posted that I no longer think of myself as a fraud when I call myself an author, because
you could say that. Yeah, yeah,
yeah, it's one of those things where even when you hit some mild success, with like the first time I hit USA Today, I'm like, I kind of snuck in somehow. I don't know what
yeah. Well,
I fooled some people, but I don't know. After 3 times for 3 different novels, and
yeah,
I'm now at a stage where I'm going, yeah, my rating's not that bad.
yeah, yeah.
yeah. Uh,
So was that first time getting the edits back a little bit of a whack to the ego at all, or was
Oh
it
yeah,
worse than?
no.
Yeah.
I joke that if when you get your edits back, you aren't ready to curse the editor out, they're probably not being a
Honest.
good editor for
Yeah.
you. I mean, especially if you're starting out. Now, I mean, like nowadays, I do get, like I've got a top quality editor that I use, and I still get plenty of changes, and I notice, or I've realized, I write fat. In other words, I use more words often than I actually need.
Okay.
And that's just one of my personal writing style weaknesses, and the editor helps with that. But
Hmm.
I'm still working on that problem. But I'm now at the stage where, and this is, potentially millions of words later from the first manuscript. I'm now at a stage where the edits that I get back, like it's almost never about the story. The
Hmm.
story, no comments back from the editor. The story is what the story is. No suggestions, no holes. I'm actually, from the beginning, I was actually pretty good at that. It's about the prose and not grammar. It's just, I joke, but it's actually serious. I'll send it to the editor, and my text will get a 15% diet, because it'll come back 15% lighter, because
Yeah.
he'll just remove like 15% of the words, and it still sounds great. Yeah, it's
Hmm.
like, I'm like, okay.
What is your
Uh,
average book at number of words at publication?
it
How many
varies,
words?
anywhere from 80 at kind of the smallest, 80K, to 125K, and I think it really depends on how many POVs you have. Like the largest one was Primordial Threat, and that one has 4, maybe even 5 POVs.
Oh,
Um,
yeah, something like
so
that.
so so I mean, I think your word count will expand when you're doing that. Now,
Hmm.
I think stereotypically certain genres are heavier on the word count, like fantasy tends to be more.
Hmm.
And I think more of that has to do with just when you set a story in the modern world, you don't have to explain what a street looks like typically. I mean,
Sure.
there's a lot
Yeah.
of things you don't have to describe, where in a fantasy world you might have to, because
Hmm.
everything's new, so
Hmm.
you can't assume anything. But
Yep. Yep.
yeah, 80 to
So
125.
okay. Okay. Great. When you're putting together your plot lines and things like that, how do you put together your plots? Is it writing it out in a Word doc, Excel spreadsheet? Do you keep it all in your head? Things
Um,
like that.
so I'll usually have a two documents up at the same time. The one I'm working on, that actual book, and the other one is, I hesitate nowadays to even call it an outline. It's more. I used to outline heavily,
Hmm.
and one of the feedback items and one of the things I learned over time was it's very hard to get the nuances right of how the story is going to evolve, and or all of the elements are, you're going to end up changing the outline as you're writing it anyway. But it's good to have one because you have goalposts. So
Hmm.
instead of actually like having a 20-page or 30-page outline of what I'm going to do, I oftentimes will actually just write out the first chapter or two freehand off my head. I know where I want a book to end always. Before I even start, I know where I want the book to end, and I know what the hook is and stuff like that, and I'll know like the next chapter or two without a doubt, and then on that outline page or document, I'll have probably some mileposts of, here are scenes that I know I want to include. How I'll get there, I don't know necessarily, but along the ways, I'll describe a couple scenes that I know need to happen for this to make sense. And
Sure.
then, and then I kind of just let it evolve. And usually, like for instance, I'll always have, the first two chapters or so, I'll know exactly what I need to write. So I'll have those in the
Hmm.
outline. And then by the time I finish writing the second chapter, I'll know where I want to go. So I'll before I actually close a doc for that day, I'll write in the outline doc, what is the next chapter about, or maybe
Okay.
even
Okay.
the next chapter and a half to two chapters, because
Okay.
it'll be fresh in my mind. I'll know what should happen next, and then and as long as I'm keeping in mind where I need to eventually get to, yeah, we're good. And it's actually worked really well for me, that approach.
Okay.
It's a mix between outlining and pantsing,
Do
when
you
it comes
know
to
like
that.
certain technologies you want to include in a book?
Um,
Things like that?
yeah, typically. So it depends on what genre I'm writing. Sometimes that just comes out of like an example of like the Levi, or even like Darwin cipher. So most of my books have an addendum where I actually talk about the science at depth, and obviously the goal is always, you don't need to have a science background to be able to read any of this stuff, but I inevitably tend to add science things. I let that come naturally. So, like for instance, if I have, and I've got a fairly wide background in it, so I know what's real, what's not real, and even real being, on research side.
Hmm.
So for me, it's actually very easy for me to go, you know what? It would be kind of cool if we did this kind of DNA editing type of thing. And like for the whole premise, I won't give away some of the plot lines on Darwin Cipher, but
Hmm.
Darwin Cipher has a lot to do with what happens when people mess around with DNA, and with the goal being to cure cancer. And I realized, like, well, you know what, and this isn't really giving anything away because it's like in the first two chapters or so, but there just happens to be some of them I'm inspired by an article,
Hmm.
where I was reading an article, let's say about elephants or something, and in this case it was elephants, and it just anecdotally said, elephants tend never to get tumors, like
Hmm.
cancerous tumors. I was like, okay, why is that? So I started doing
Hmm.
research. Why is that? and,
Hmm.
and it has to do with the genetics and how cells replicate. And I'm like, you know what? What if I do this, and this, and apply
Hmm.
that to human beings, and it's DNA editing, and that's how Darwin's cipher was actually born.
Okay.
Is just an inspiration from a magazine article that just randomly happened to toss in that piece of trivia. I'm like, you know what?
Hmm.
I didn't know that. Let me go read up on it and go, oh, interesting. And and the mental juices started flowing, going, well, how can I turn that into a novel? I'm like, oh, okay,
Sure.
yeah, I know how
Well,
to do that.
let's read a little intro from that because I've got that open here. So,
Sure.
John LaForce scrambled down the steep path leading into Tibucoo Valley and took a swig from the cheap red wine he'd bought from a nearby gas station. Almost immediately, a flush crept up his neck and warmed his cheeks. He'd just been fired for the second time this month. He wasn't sure what had brought him out into the middle of nowhere in southeastern Nevada. When he was a kid, his friends used to talk about coming out here to spy on the military planes as they took off and landed. They used to whisper about secret experiments, mysterious clouds in the sky, and of course, UFOs. After all, this was supposed to be where they kept those aliens, Area 51. John didn't believe any of that crap, and he doubted any of his friends had ever had the guts to actually sneak onto the grounds or even come out this way. And as he looked around, he had to admit they weren't missing much, just acres of thick desert sagebrush. Taking another swig from his bottle, John felt the buzz from the alcohol as he scrambled down the slope. Suddenly, something broke through the thick sagebrush at the bottom of the hill. John drew his Glock from its holster and took a shooter's stance. Bobcats sometimes prowled this area. But it was just a stray dog, dark brown coat, long tail, floppy ears, might be a chocolate lab. John holstered his gun and whistled. Hey, boy, what are you doing out here? The dog wagged its tail furiously and bounded toward him. He screwed the top back on the wine bottle and held his hand out for the dog to sniff. As the animal huffed at his hand and ran its nose up and down the legs of his trousers, John noticed a bloody wound on its front right leg. Did something take a bite out of you, old boy? The dog whined and glanced back toward the scrub. John scratched the dog's head. Your coat's nice and shiny and you look well fed. He shook his head and patted the dog on its back. What are you doing out here? Someone's probably looking for you. Maybe I should get you to a shelter and see if they can find your owner. I sure as hell can't take care of you. I can barely take care of myself nowadays. A rustle of movement sounded in the sagebrush about 50 yards away. The dog whined, took a few steps up the slope, and turned to John as if to say, Are you coming? John drew the Glock once more and took a step toward the sound. The lab darted in front of him and gave a low growl. Shh. John stepped around the dog. The dog whined, nipped at his pant leg, and pulled hard on his jeans, trying to drag him up the slope away from the sound. What the hell are you doing, Mutt? John yanked his leg away and gave the dog a sideways kick, which it easily dodged. The dog backed away, whining, then yipped once and raced up the hill. At the base of the slope, two dark animals burst through the sagebrush. Two more dogs, both nearly identical in appearance to the chocolate lab, but very different in demeanor. These dogs had neither wagging tails nor lolling tongues. They eyed John menacingly, lowered their heads, and stalked closer. John aimed his gun and called out in a friendly tone, Hey boys, are you missing a friend of yours? As soon as he trained the Glock on the animals, they split, one going to his left, the other to his right. His heart thudding, John aimed at the dog on his right. The animal immediately darted behind a boulder. It was almost as if the animal knew the gun was dangerous. Hearing the other dog's nails scraping on the gravel, John wheeled around and fired a warning shot. The animal continued to advance, but it used a jerky zigzag pattern, making it difficult to aim. A chill ran up John's spine. His gun arm shaking, John focused on the approaching dog. For a split second, his mind flashed back to his time as an artilleryman in Afghanistan. Back then, he'd shot at enemies he could barely see. Now, for the first time in his life, he was within spitting distance of his target as he squeezed the trigger. The animal had just begun to leap when the bullet slammed into its shoulder. It fell to the ground with a whimper. At almost the same time, John felt over 100 pounds of canine smash against his back. The second dog knocked him off his feet and clamped its vice-like jaws on the wrist of his shooting hand. John struggled with the growling animal. He started to yell when his voice was suddenly trapped in his throat. The dog he'd shot had clamped down tightly on his throat. He fell back onto the dirt, his windpipe closing under the crushing force of the animal's impossibly strong jaws. His vision wavered as he strained for breath. His heart pounding with terror, he prayed, My God, there's so much I could have. And the world faded to black. So that's a great way to start a book out by killing somebody off
Yep.
and in a pretty good grisly fashion.
Yep. Yep. Don't know what's going to happen, but you know that
Something's not right.
you know the genre generally speaking. So this isn't a kid's book. Yeah. So.
Yep, exactly. So Darwin Cipher, that one came out this last year, right? I
Yeah.
believe. Yep. Okay.
Yeah, I think end of
End of
2019, maybe.
2019.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. What do you have coming out next?
Oddly enough, so I've got something coming out in February that is completely speculative on my part. So
Okay.
I've recently started, when I was a kid, I played Dungeons and Dragons. So again,
I resemble that remark. So yeah.
yeah. So that's the whole epic fantasy. It all worked out.
Okay.
So
I thought you said you didn't do epic fantasy, but
I don't. But it became one of those things where I started playing D&D again with a bunch of other authors.
okay.
And it started making me think. I'm going, all right, well, because everything I do, has a focus on science in some way, even though that may not be the theme of the book. I
Hmm.
weave those elements in it, and I'm going, you know, and I started studying because one of the genres that's very popular is something called lit RPG, or at least that's what they call it. I don't think Trad Pub calls it that, but
Hmm.
they call it fantasy. But which is basic, and it turns out that and it's the closest thing to D&D in a novel form. Caveat the Dragonlance novels from
Sure.
Tracy Hickman and whatnot, but and Salvatore. Nowadays, they seem to enjoy. It seems to have a lot of success with books that have people that are having out of world experiences where they're playing a game and then they suddenly find themselves playing the game in its
Gotcha.
real life. And
Sure.
I think there was a recent movie, Spielberg had done it. I forget the name of it now, but it falls in the same theme. It's like virtual reality and this and that. And I'm like, you know what? All that is very, very, very unrealistic. But that doesn't matter. But for me, the thing I do, I'm like, I like to at least have some plausibility with even if it's science fiction heavy on the fiction.
Hmm.
I want it somewhat plausible.
Sure.
And the whole virtual reality turning into reality thing is, it didn't feel right for what I was going to write. And I was like, but I still wanted to write something with D&D, and just writing a pure epic fantasy wasn't exactly what I was looking at. Coming out at the end of next month, I actually have something coming out that basically, the premise is imagine ex-military, ex-special forces, actually, military guy who finds himself, looking for a job. He went, got out of the army and went back to school, finished his
Hmm.
master's, got an offer to for this government job, which looked like it might be an opportunity for him to get back into some action, but it was all very hush hush, top secret. So they couldn't really tell him what he was hiring for other than the requirements.
Hmm.
So he joined up, and it turned out to be that a science experiment that
Okay.
uh, landed him as part of a. If you've ever seen the movie Avatar,
Hmm.
one of the premises of the Avatar was that you had these space marines or whatever who were remote controlling bodies on a planet, essentially.
Hmm.
So they weren't actually on the planet having these adventures, but they were buckled into these systems that they saw and heard and felt like
Hmm.
they were there. The premise of the experiment was very much like that, which isn't that implausible. To make a long story short and not give anything away about some of it, he finds himself in a situation where the experiment that should have lasted only about 5 minutes looks like he's stuck in that experiment.
Okay.
And that experiment turns into he ends up in a place where some of the laws of physics are mostly the same, but not quite. Some things are different. And imagine, if you will, a world where if you just tweak a few things about how our science works,
Hmm.
some of the aspects of a D&D world could become true. And so that's where I play the story. I take it
Okay.
from a point of view of a character who knows nothing about gaming, is not a gamer, and which deviates heavily from what lit RPG does, because these are all gamers doing gaming things, and then it becomes real. This is a guy who has nothing to do with gaming, and he finds himself in a world that, if you're a gamer reading this book, you're going to go, oh, I recognize that. It's like, so these are new concepts being introduced to the POV character that, I'm trying to pull in an audience. That's why I say it's experimental for my part, because I'm writing something that I believe should be entertaining, hopefully, to a thriller audience as well as a fantasy audience.
Sure.
And those two don't have a huge, Venn diagram overlap necessarily.
Yeah.
But the
Never
story
know.
does start off very much like a thriller, and ends up resembling something different. So we'll see.
Well, I think I'm not trying to criticize some of the more epic fantasy authors out there, but I think they get a little bit too caught up in their world sometimes, and don't worry as much about making things epic, or making things readable as much as they worry about word counts or something like that, or trying to tell every impossible part of a story or all that kind of, I don't know what the right word is for that, but I hope you know what I mean by that.
Well,
But
yeah, I mean, well, inevitably, when you're introducing an entire new world, you inevitably get caught up in the world building of
the
it, which
minutia,
which
the
which,
minutia,
which
yeah.
has to happen. Now, every little thing, like for instance, going into this new world. Yes, I could spend a whole lot of time on this new language and whatnot and everything else. And a lot of people toss in foreign languages, make up weird words and stuff like that. And that's not to criticize it. It's just I don't think it's necessary to tell a story. I think inevitably, like just as it from a writing perspective, imagine you land, in this book, you land in a new world. It is a different language. I mean, that would it would be hard to believe that, oh, all these people speak English. However, how do you bridge that gap?
Yep.
And for me, some things are unexplained right up front, and you figure out later why some of this stuff happens. But all
Gotcha.
this guy knows is he ends up in this other world, which he was expecting to happen. He was not expecting to meet anyone. As far as he knew, it was kind of like a Neil Armstrong landing on the moon thing. It was like, oh, I'm here, great. And that was the experiment. And when he gets stuck, it turns out he finds some people, and they don't speak his language, but for whatever reason, he can hear their thoughts as they're speaking. So he hears
Right.
something that is nonsensical, but he seems to understand in his head what they're saying.
Okay.
And that allows him to learn the language. So I don't belabor the differences in the language much, but I at least give some homage to, there is a different language, and just due to the circumstances, he's able to overcome some of it. And we don't go too crazy. I don't go too crazy on the strange, bizarre names with 12 apostrophes and 14 consonants and
Sure.
everything else.
So, I mean, that sounds a little bit of a parallel to the Codebreaker book that you had a little bit in
Hmm.
some ways, in terms
Yeah.
of some of the technology, or bringing the fantasy part of it into real world, as well as the, the thought connection and things like that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the Codebreaker was, Codebreaker is one of those books where, I started dabbling in what what is to me, kind of a mishmash between thriller and epic fantasy.
Yeah.
And
That one kind of tends to bridge science fiction and fantasy and kind of
yeah.
thriller type stuff. So yeah.
Yeah, because you have a lot of action, a lot of thriller-esque things, especially KGB, assassins,
Hmm.
et cetera, and that's the kind of book that I don't think could get published outside of the indie world. Because largely, and there's a lot of good reasons for that. Because Codebreaker to me was more about, uh, this was me experimenting, and that was a drawer novel, something I stuffed in a drawer for a long time, that I never wanted or thought to publish. But
Sure.
when I started, to me it was, a publisher isn't going to publish something that is going to be difficult to sell. And there's a Venn diagram of, okay, I cater to thriller readers, I cater to fantasy readers, and like like I said before, when you have this mishmash of genres, you look at the Venn diagram and it's a small intersection. A publisher's gonna
Yeah.
go, I don't think so.
Yeah.
um,
Yep. Yep.
so
My
for
audience
me,
is 10 people in Provo, Utah, or something like that. Right.
right,
Yeah.
and so that's not the kind of thing. So I never attempted to sell that, or
Hmm.
or go anywhere with it. The odd thing is that the whole thing that actually landed me in the indie world at all was Primordial Threat.
Hmm.
So
That was
I'd
your,
actually
was that your first, that was your
it was
first published one? Yeah.
it was the first one I went out indie, and it wasn't going to be indie at first. So I won't call out the publisher, but it was one of the one of the big five publishers. Editor,
Hmm.
wanted to acquire it, but and this is where I find it unfortunate, and it's a societal thing at this point. So
Hmm.
without doubt, if anyone's looking at the video, I'm a white male, which shouldn't be here nor there matter at all, with regards to I'm the author and I happen to be white
Shouldn't
and
be.
male
Yeah.
and Jewish. Oh, by the way. So that's all great, fine, whatever. Now,
Hmm.
I'd written a book. Primordial Threat has a couple of main POVs. It has, a woman president.
Hmm.
Okay. And to be fully descriptive, just
Hmm.
a white woman president. I have
Black main lead character. Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, the hero of the story, or arguably the hero of the story, is a black. So I'm a white male scientist. He's a black male scientist, and you've got a cop, former military, but essentially
Hmm.
a cop, who's a white male guy, and another scientist, white male, and then another female scientist who's of Indian descent,
Hmm.
East Indian. Uh, so it's a pretty diverse cast of characters, but that's not the point I'm trying to
Yeah.
make. When the editor wanted to talk to me about it, I was like, okay, cool. So yeah, because he said he was interested and he wanted to talk. I'm like, okay, well, fine.
Yeah.
And when he talked, yeah, he said lots of good things about the book. He really liked, this, that, and everything else. I was like, all right, great. This is going the direction I was hoping it
Hmm.
was going to go. And then he said, I was wondering, there's one thing I'd like you to find out whether you'd be willing to do is, there's something about one of the characters I think needs to get changed, and it happened to be with the black scientist. The main character is, in my mind, the main character. He didn't want him to be black. And I'm like, excuse me, why? And it boiled down to, the editor, acquiring editor, didn't believe that he could get it past his review board because they were subscribing to something called Own Voices. I was like, what in the world is Own Voices? And as it was explained to me, and I later looked up,
Cultural
it,
appropriation. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Own Voices was all about, leaving room for people to write their stories about their situation, their lived experiences, and stuff like that. And I was like, so you're telling me, the white male scientist can't write about a black male scientist? Yeah,
So all I can have in my book then is white male characters because that's all that I know. Right.
right.
Basically.
And I was like, all right, so how about this? I'm going to tell you that there's no way I'm going to do that, because as soon as I say yes to that, where does it end?
Hmm. Exactly.
Um,
Yep.
and he's like, okay, well, I was afraid that you said that, and ended up parting ways.
Yeah.
And I was so disgusted with that. 6 weeks later, I self-published it,
Hmm.
and I think 2 months later, it was on the USA Today
Good for you.
bestsellers list.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
and I never went back. I'm not, I'm a political creature to an extent, but I thought better. I thought better of the
Yeah.
publishing world, and that cured me of that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I was like, you know what, I'm done. Yeah,
Yeah, and I think I've seen that through other authors that I follow, like Larry Correa
yeah,
and anybody, anybody else that is more on the conservative side, personality wise, or libertarian, or any. It's the world. I've tried not to get too heavily political on it here yet, and I'm still trying to avoid that because I want to make this a podcast that anybody can listen to. But at the same time, I think this kind of cancel type culture and things like that is one of the worst features of today's society, and
Yeah,
it doesn't make any sense to me. So
and to be honest, it really doesn't have much to do, in my opinion, about conservatism versus anything else. Because I've seen the same problem occur to people who are on the left, but
true.
they
Yeah.
wrote the wrong kind of story, or they felt. Yeah, it really boils down to identity politics, in as
Hmm.
much as, like I know one, I forget her name, and I'm sorry, because we're friends, but yeah, yeah, uh, uh, she ended up getting harassed so heavily because, I'll anonymize it, but let's just say that it was a Chinese female main character, and she portrayed it as, in a certain way that, I guess, even though she was Chinese, and again, I'm obfuscating the details to avoid
Sure.
labeling anyone, but it was like, imagine you have a female Chinese author who's writing about a female Chinese person in a war scenario, and
Hmm.
she got lambasted, and then ended up pulling her own book
Hmm.
because,
Yeah, I remember that one. Yep. Yep.
she succumbed to, it was appropriating others' lived experience. I mean, you can pull this thread as far as you want, but it comes
Yep.
down to people unhappy with portrayals of certain identities. You can't do
Hmm.
this, you can't do that. I was like, I don't need anyone's permission. I mean, this goes back to a book like called The Outsiders,
Hmm.
where S.E. Hinton wrote a book. I think it was in the 70s. And it
Hmm.
was an excellent book, but it was marketed as a boys' book because there's primarily boys
Yep.
in
Yep.
it.
Yeah, I
Now,
read it. Yeah.
S.E. Hinton, her name is Susan, as the author, but they obfuscated her name because they didn't think they'd be able to sell a boys' book if it was a woman writing it. Um, and so it's just gotten worse since then. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, that one is almost legitimate. You can get that. There's a, ew, boys don't
Hmm.
like girls, or girls don't like boys, whatever. Yeah. So that one's almost justifiable from a marketing point of view. It shouldn't be that way, but it is. But it's gotten much worse.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and to me, it's just it's silly.
Well, and the fact that that we can't really have different opinions about anything these days without somebody, screaming and going crazy and, not respecting that opinion and not having differences, I think is just ridiculous. How are you supposed to disagree about anything? I just need to toe the line to whatever you tell me,
Yeah.
that kind of a thing. So,
It used to be colleges were bastions of open and free speech and communication, and it's not that anymore.
hmm.
And people are coming out of some of these colleges. I mean, not most of them aren't, but a lot of them, most vocal ones, are coming
Yeah.
out thinking that they never believed themselves to be inflexible, and they feel themselves to be very accepting of other people's opinions, but they're shocked whenever they find out that there's someone that has a different opinion. That
That's passionate about it and
uh,
believes in it. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, and so it follows a lot of stereotypes, but the what one side thinks the other one's misguided, the other side thinks the other one's is evil. Yeah, and it's
Hmm.
unfortunate.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and that leads to cancel cultures and all sorts of other stuff.
I just wish we could find some way. I think I honestly see things getting worse before they get better. I'm not sure how much worse they could actually get than they are, but
Yeah.
I think people need to go back and read some of the books, especially like Viktor Frankl and Solzhenitsyn and things like that, and see how bad it can really get before they start to figure out and express their own opinions. But
No,
that's
I'm a firm believer that when you start focusing on making up new pronouns, or
yep,
you have other things that you're so worried about, you clearly don't have enough to worry about.
yeah,
You
exactly,
have a
and
very easy life. The person sitting in a rice paddy, picking rice, isn't worried about these things. They think they're ridiculous. So, yeah.
yeah, yeah. That's I mean, especially I'm going to be reviewing Jordan Peterson's book on here within the next few weeks too, and I really he's polarizing as well,
Yeah,
but I think there's a lot about what he says as far as clean your own house before you worry about everybody else's house, and
agreed, agreed.
so
Yeah,
especially talk about faith on here as well, and that's one of the big things is we're all sinners, and we've all got our own issues to take care of, so nobody else's problem is any better or worse than your own problems. You're just not willing to admit, most people aren't willing to admit what their biggest problems are. So
yep.
yeah.
Most people lack self-awareness.
Yep. I do. I do also like your. We talked. You mentioned switching subjects here a little bit, but you talked about your food, your approach to food, or that you're kind of a foodie as well. But I just had to read a little bit of your post on Limburger cheese because I thought
Uh,
that was especially good. So I noticed this cheese today in the supermarket. It reminded me of something not that long ago. I made the mistake a few years of getting into the mood to taste some cheeses I hadn't had before. Well, for whatever reason, being somewhat of a gastronomical adventurer, I did pick up a couple of the blue vein types, a couple of the other somewhat unfamiliar cow and goat cheeses, and some of the more adventuresome, creamy, oozy, smelly types. You can't really get too adventurous in the US. I'll skip that part, but since we have to be pasteurized and all that fun stuff. I really do enjoy a good blue cheese, especially with a nice apple or tart accompaniment. I would agree with that as well. Or blue cheese I'll put it on a steak sometime also. But some of the oozy, smelly types were okay, most of which for me were nothing to write home about. But I did run into one cheese that was quite unique, and most of us have heard of it before, maybe as a gag in a Looney Tunes cartoon. Though I'm not sure if any of you have been foolish enough to try it. And Limburger cheese. My grandfather used to eat Limburger with onions and pickles, I think, as well, things like
yeah.
that. So all I can say is when I first approached this, it was with some definite trepidation. If you've never smelled a good pungent Limburger, you've never quite experienced what a dirty diaper that has been left to sit in the bottom of a diaper pill for a week or so smells like. And I can only imagine. But well, no, given that I have an 18-year-old, but I also remarried, and I now have a 7, 5, and 1 year olds. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm right in
You're
the
living
dirty
the
diaper
dream.
say. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm living the dream there. So the bacteria used to ferment Limburger and other rind wash cheeses is Brevibacterium linens. It is, I pronounce that right, hopefully.
Yeah.
So this
Yeah.
same bacteria is found on human skin and is partially responsible for human body odor. A likely reason for this is the monks of Limburg who created the cheese would originally mix the milk and curds into cheese by stomping it with their presumably bare feet. Wow, did take the next step and taste it. It's probably the most horrendous thing I've ever put in my mouth. So,
Yeah.
and it had a nice effect on your house as well. So,
Oh yeah, yeah. No, that was definitely a biohazard, yeah, as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, I will never, denigrate someone else's choice to eat it. Like I've had kazu marzu before, and and
okay.
that's just nasty, nasty. I mean,
What
if
is
you're
it? Is that
into
the one with maggots growing in it,
it
I
is,
believe?
it
Oh,
is.
jeez.
Yeah, yeah. When I was in Sicily, yeah. I mean, unless you're into ammonia, I just don't understand. Like, why anyone would be possessed to eat that. And the funny thing is that the local advice is like you want to make sure that the maggots are still moving. I was like, oh great, why? Yeah, well, if they're not moving, that means that the cheese has gone over. It's
Oh,
probably not
lovely.
good
Yeah.
anymore. I'm like, I guess that makes sense. If they're alive, it's not going to kill you.
Yeah.
So,
Yep,
uh,
exactly. So, what does a good meal look like to you?
yeah. So, I guess I'm a steak and potatoes type of person. I mean, so
Okay.
for me, it varies. I
Yeah.
really like, yeah, I mean, something that I really like fried food. So probably one of my favorite dishes that I make, or I have at a restaurant, would be like a chicken marsala, which is really kind of like
Okay.
a fried cutlet with marsala
Hmm.
wine, mushrooms, fettuccine,
Now,
that
do you
kind of
live
thing.
in the Seattle area? Is that right? Or
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah, just
Okay.
outside. Yeah,
Okay. Yeah, there's a lot of great places. Used to travel doing software consulting and spent quite a bit of time in downtown Seattle, so it's
yeah.
awesome. But well, maybe not quite so much anymore, but
Yeah,
it's yeah.
yeah. Some parts of it are evolving. Yeah,
Yeah.
luckily it's mostly contained, but yeah, let's put it this way, it's not as bad as Portland. Yeah, the Portland, folks,
Yeah.
they're getting what they deserve. They voted those people in, so
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of changes that have gone on there. I had some friends that moved out there specifically for what it used to be about 20 years ago, but
right.
it is not that anymore, I don't think. So, yeah.
No, no, it's unfortunate, but
Yep. last time I was in Seattle was in the midst of that whole, what was it, the Million Man thing or the 99% or 99% march
Yeah,
and things like that, and
yeah.
it was not all that impressive. But so let's see. I had a couple. Oh yeah, I was going to ask you about Primordial Threat. I saw. I hope I'm not giving too much away to say that you're using an Alcubierre sphere in there.
Hmm.
Have you ever read Arc by Stephen Baxter at all?
I have not. No,
No? Okay.
no.
He uses one that's a bit smaller in there, but that's the only two places in all the books I took me a while. I'm like, I wonder if that's what he's there's some similar things in that book where the earth gets flooded by the water coming out from the ground. And you had mentioned that, I think, in Primordial Thread as well, about the type of rock
Yeah, yeah,
in
yeah.
there as well. So that might be one to pick up. But who are you reading today? If you do any, if you have
Um,
time for reading, I guess. But
yeah. I haven't been doing much reading recently. I will say some of the stuff that I have read. I guess the advice is always to whatever genre you're right into.
mhm,
Read who the bestsellers are. So I
sure.
was reading a lot of Lee Child just to get a feel for because I like the idea of, I mean, so fantasies tend to have these series where they're all a linked story. So like,
Hmm.
one book one leads directly into book two.
Sure.
You don't want to start book two without having read book one, et cetera, et cetera.
Hmm.
Whereas like stuff like, in the thriller genre, you tend not to have that. You tend to have more like serialized stories where they're all
Hmm.
kind of self-contained, beginning, end, but they all have the common universe, the common set of
Hmm.
characters. It's like a 007 as an example, that people will be familiar with, where you can pick up, and watch, let's say, any of the 007 movies as an
Yep.
example, and not need to know what happened in a prior movie because it has nothing to do with anything.
Mm.
007's a member of the British Secret Service, and et cetera, et cetera, and it's a story,
Yep.
self-contained.
Yep.
So I like the concept of that because I wanted to be able to write something like what Lee Child was doing with his Jack Reacher stuff.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, I love those
so
books
so
also.
so
Yeah.
so I modeled. I mean, I did a lot of the reading just so I can get a feel for what does he do, how are they constructed. So for me, it was. Being an author kind of ruins me as a reader in as much as I do a lot of
Because you're
analysis.
analyzing. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yep. Yep.
and I'm
Do you
going,
find
oh, okay.
yourself checking the science as well on things on books you read?
Yeah, I'm always disappointed with the science, so I try not to. It's like, like for instance, probably one of the best books I read. I think it was released maybe 2018 or maybe 2019, but
Okay.
it was Blake Crouch wrote something called Dark Matter. Now, Dark
Okay.
Matter, I happen to know a lot about. It's in my area of study, and the book has nothing to do with dark matter. I mean, yeah. I mean, it's an excellent book. It's probably one of the best ones I read that year. I like to tell people that you should read that book because when you're done, you're gonna want to hug your family. It's an excellent book.
Okay.
However, and he dips his toe into some science-like things, but it has nothing to do with
Yeah.
dark matter. It has nothing to do with real science. But it's
Going
an
to say you might
excellent read.
actually like that arc book by Stephen Baxter then, because he does talk about the Alcubierre sphere is pretty well. I thought, I'm not a science guy as much as you are, definitely, but he also used to get the ship off the Earth. They used nuclear explosions because they couldn't get a rocket big enough built. So
Yeah.
they actually had a series of nuclear bombs to get it off. And I think, if I remember right, that was based off some studies NASA did
Oh yeah, yeah.
back.
There was
Yeah.
a project. There was a project
Yep.
that used a pusher plate to
Yep.
dumped a nuclear bomb behind it, and the
Hmm.
explosion would push the pusher plate and
Yep. Yep.
cause. It was not necessarily efficient, but
If you don't
it
care
was
what you leave behind you when you're all
yeah,
done, then
yeah.
yeah,
It definitely puts a new spin on pollution. It's like but yeah. I'm very familiar with that concept.
sure.
So.
So, what does a writing day look like to you, or what is a standard day? You're still working a regular job.
Yes. Yes.
What does a regular day look like for you, where you get some writing in?
So let's see. Regular day would be probably 4 a.m. Wake up, Usually
Wow.
get about
Okay.
2 hours writing in at, give or take, maybe
Okay.
3. It depends on how, depends on my schedule. Then usually right after that, especially now that I'm working from home due to COVID and everything
Hmm.
else, that's the work
Yep.
harder thing.
Yep.
Um, after I'm done writing, shower, whatever, and I'll, walk a couple steps over to my office at home and start my day. That will usually last till about, it depends on the day,
Hmm.
but let's say 7 p.m. or so.
Okay.
Somewhere along the way, I have some lunch and dinner, and I'll probably go to sleep at 10ish, 11ish.
Wash, rinse,
Uh,
repeat kind of thing. Yeah.
and wash, rinse, repeat.
Yeah.
So I usually get my writing done in the early mornings,
Okay.
first thing. And what I typically do is whatever I wrote the prior week, or the prior day, that next day I'll go edit it. I
Okay.
mean, I write semi-clean first draft, but it's always crap, with fresh eyes the next day. So
Yeah.
I'll always edit whatever I wrote the prior day first before I start putting new stuff down. And so I'll probably
Gotcha.
spend my first half hour, an hour editing whatever I had, and then write new stuff.
What is a good day for you, word count wise, or do you worry about word count at all per day?
Um, so I know that I can reliably, even with job one, I can reliably do 2,000 words.
Okay.
I theoretically should be able to do more on the weekends, but I tend not to. I try to stick to about 2,000 words. So and for me, it typically means that even though I might be able to write, so like a schedule for a book, as an example. So let's say it's 100,000 word book. So I could write a book theoretically in 2 months, but realistically, so 2 months, and if I've scheduled it, ideally, as soon as I'm done, I can hand it off to the editor. Now, sometimes there may be a delay, or I didn't schedule it right, so
Hmm.
it may have to wait. But let's assume as soon as I'm done with that, editor gets it. He's usually about 2 weeks to go get me back the draft, give or take. He's usually pretty good about 2 weeks, and then I'll go ahead and read through everything that he's done. And I no longer do the copy the changes over. I now because I've got a trusting relationship with a top notch editor. I generally trust what he does, and what I'll do is I'll do an accept all, and then I'll just read it from scratch, and
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
I'll inevitably do edits again on
Well,
top
that's
of it.
probably part of getting a good editor is that they can learn your voice a little bit and start to, if they got to make changes, they'll do it in your voice a little bit. Or the
Yeah,
way.
yeah, and I mean, this guy was pretty good about that. It's just where sometimes, especially if I'm getting into very technical things, and that's why I always have, when I'm in this phase of post editing, I'll have the original that I sent him up on
Oh,
the
okay. Kind
side.
of compare a little bit at least.
Yeah, so as I'm reading the accepted version, I'll go, something's missing, or it doesn't feel exactly right. So I'll actually, that's why, I mean, because no one's perfect. So if I ever find a bug or something like that, I always have the original intent. So all my intent is certainly
Sure.
captured there. If I didn't write it well, that's a separate issue. But if he edited out something that I think needed to be there, and I could tell, that's where I go to the old one and go, oh yeah, he missed all right, this is important. Let me go
Hmm.
pull that back in and stuff like that. So but it usually takes me about a week or two, maybe, to get that all squared away. Now, obviously, concurrent to all this, I've got the artist doing his thing. Now that I do things in multiple languages, what
Okay.
I'll, so
Translation efforts and things like that. Yeah.
so I've got translators lined up typically at this point. So usually when I'm ready to publish in English, I hand off to the translators, let's say, to do German. And then, even though I work with voice, audio companies in the US, and for the English market, I work directly with voice artists in Germany. So
Oh, okay. Okay.
I do that, and that's all kind of just like a factory line. It's like as soon as the translator is done, the translator, sends it back to me. I obviously pay him, and and I send that manuscript over to the voice artist. The voice artist starts doing his thing.
So you're still doing a lot of that maybe a traditional
publisher
would handle behind the scenes and
Yeah.
take their cut for, I'm guessing, as well. So
Oh yeah. So and I had this conversation at like late last night with another author on a Zoom call because he opted to go with a smaller press. And the smaller, and I was like, why do you do that? Because I knew he could. Some people don't want to be bothered with even laying out their own book, or to me, that's all very simple. I can do that with my eyes closed. But he's like, I just don't have the time or want to hassle with it. And I was like, okay, I mean, that's a legitimate reason to go to a publisher. And theoretically, I don't have the time either. But I find this, I'm a bit of a control freak, so now that I have artists that I very much like, and I've got my little network of folks for my factory, it's easy for me to control. So my goal is to get my wife to retire so I can hand some of that stuff off to her and train her up. But and I can just focus on writing. But until then, I do everything.
So what are some of your family I mean, I don't want to go too deep into family if you don't want to, but what are some of your family challenges with that kind of a schedule? Is it a little tough sometimes?
Well, I think inevitably you have to have a very understanding family. Now it just happens to be, I'm I guess lucky in that way. We're all very busy, and with COVID and everything being remote, it's just I got kids waking up at 3 p.m. I got kids. I mean, we're all on such ridiculous schedules that the whole family meals things have gone. Even though everyone's theoretically working or studying from home.
Sure.
It's kind of a mess. So COVID's definitely thrown a wrench into the way things work, so to speak.
Yep, it sure has.
Because like for my kids, they I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Real Genius, but there's a scene where the professors the professors got so bored with teaching the class that they started, this is reel to reel tape. They pre-recorded the lecture and wrote stuff on the board, and then and then the student would come in and it was the reel to reel tape just playing. So that's actually the experience that college kids are having now, because I mean some of them, like my youngest has college where it's actually an interactive Zoom. My oldest one, a lot of his class, his classes, it's just it's pre-recorded stuff. I mean, it's so he can literally take it, do his class at 2 a.m. That's fine. I mean, there's no set time for his class, which is just bizarre to me. And again, it violates my control freak nature, because I want to see him going to school, and it's like
exactly.
there's no seeing that.
Well, it would be nice to be able to have that interaction. That's how you theoretically learn stuff too, is being able to ask questions. I mean, my best classes in college were ones where we had that interaction with teachers, but that was,
and the teachers always have office hours and whatever, so they're available. But it's not a lecture. It's not what certainly most of us grew up with when it comes to college.
Definitely. Well, hopefully the world comes back into sanity soon, and we'll get everybody back where they're supposed to be. So at least to some degree. So the book you've got coming out in February, do you have a title for it?
Yeah, it's called The Planeswalker. It'll come out probably end of February. I'll probably anyone who looks on my Facebook or otherwise will probably see some covers coming out in the next couple weeks. I usually release those, and I'll actually almost certainly be doing a concurrent release, English and German. So it'll be the first set of novels that get released in both countries at the same time, or both languages at the same time.
Do you have other languages on tap as well, or not?
So I am working with an agent for Asia, and nothing solid yet, but so
good luck.
I'll always ear to the ground on that. But the German thing, likely French as well, but we'll see.
Okay. Good luck. What about after the Planeswalker? Anything else later in the year?
So I will have a follow-up to what do you call it? So there will be a book 3 of the Primordial Threat series, the Exodus
Oh, okay.
series.
Sure. Yep.
So
Yep.
there will be a book 3. I also and I officially announced this in the plane in my author's notes in the Planeswalker, but I guess I can say it here. So I will almost certainly be doing a book 2 of Darwin's Cipher.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Uh,
Well, yeah, I don't want to bust the
yeah,
ending of the book or anything like
yeah,
that, but
but
yeah.
it will be an unexpected book 2 in as much as I left it purposefully at the end, but like,
Hmm.
but it will be a story that focuses mostly on the FBI guy. It won't be
Okay.
on the medical guy. So because 2 main characters, one a doctor, the other one the FBI guy, for lack of a
Hmm.
better term, they both have their own endings in Darwin Cipher.
Sure.
I pick up with the FBI guy in book 2.
Sure.
So.
Now, I'd like to ask for, there's not a direct sequel to the Codebreaker yet, is there?
So the Codebreaker, that one was unusual because I released it in an odd order.
Yeah.
The Codebreaker is actually a book 2 of what I intend to be at least a 4-book series.
Okay.
There is a book 3 which is not a direct. I
Hmm.
talk about it as that series is very unusual because
Hmm.
it's book 1, book 2, book 3, and they're all fundamentally the starts of 3 different stories. Um,
Now,
and
is
I
book
mean,
four needs to pull them together somehow or something like that? Okay.
yeah. So like in most books, you maybe have 3 or 4 characters that all run independently, and they may somehow interact with each other at some point. So this is
Hmm.
actually 3 storylines that lead into a fourth book, and that's where I actually pick up and merge all 3 together, and
Gotcha.
you realize, without giving anything away, book 1 had a focus on a certain character, set of
Hmm.
characters. Book 2 had another, and then book 3 yet another still. So
Hmm.
I can tell you definitively that book 4 will continue with the same characters you saw in book 4 will have the same characters that you saw in book 3,
Okay.
but book 4, you're gonna some people will be surprised what happens to the threads from book 1 and book 2.
Gotcha.
Not not
Okay.
not not everybody may survive. Uh,
Well,
yeah,
sometimes that happens, right?
yeah.
I'm still, I hate to say it, but I haven't made my way through all your Levi Yoder books yet. But where did Levi Yoder come from? And then we can probably wrap it up after that. But,
Sure. Levi basically came
and
from
why an Amish kid?
yeah, yeah. That's the thing. I definitely wanted to. I started that series after having really studied the Jack Reacher
Yep.
stuff, and I wasn't going to do a Jack Reacher novel, obviously, or anything that
Hmm.
even resembled it. But I
You had to
liked how
define
Jack.
your guy. You had to kind of find your guy, right?
I like the Jack Reacher archetype in as much as he
Hmm.
was definitely very different, and so I was like, you know what, let me make something ridiculous. Who's gonna expect? So we've had mob thrillers before, and it's always some paisan out there who's in the mob, who leaves the mob or has conflicts with the mob or whatever. So why not have somebody start off with he's a mobster, and he's got a very long and sordid backstory, but it has nothing to do. The book starts nothing to do with him being a mobster. It has everything to do with he's dying.
Yeah.
He's got cancer, and his wife tragically dies. So I'm not giving anything away. That's chapter 1, and so he's a tragic character.
Hmm.
So and you only kind of get hints that he's actually a mobster. So I try to build up some sympathy for this is a guy who's going through hell and he's dying, and,
Hmm.
and suddenly his life is falling apart, and then suddenly he realizes that his cancer has gone into complete remission. So
Hmm.
now his life is falling apart, and he figured it was over, and he's just going to die alone, and
Hmm.
and whatnot, and now he's going to live,
Yeah.
and his life has still fallen apart. So
Yeah, and most of
he
the first book there is kind of pulling it all back together again a little bit, which
yes,
was,
yeah.
I thought was great.
So and I wanted, and his backstory really is about, some Amish farmer kid who ended up, not wanting, and this happens with a lot of Amish community, where, they have this Rumspringa, which is,
Rumspringa,
uh,
yep.
which gives the Amish kid an opportunity to see the real world before he commits to
hmm
living the life of, what we think of as Amish.
Although I think
And
the way you wrote him is that he was never coming back no matter what from his
yeah,
Rumspringa.
yeah, he always had an idea of, yeah, this wasn't for him. He knew he wasn't
Yeah.
in doubt. His parents may have had doubts, but yeah, he wasn't in.
hmm
And he just got involved with some interesting
hmm
characters who ended up years later becoming a mob boss.
hmm
But he, and the his best friend became a mob boss. He learned that only later. But during his time in New York before the tragedy started, he was friends with this kid whose father was the mob boss,
Sure.
and he got involved. Yeah, so you got one of the few non-Italian members of the mafia,
Yeah.
essentially.
Now,
Uh,
Jack Reacher or Lee Child, he's gone back into, as Jack Reacher's gotten older, he's kind of done some books that have gone back into his history a little bit. Are you planning
right.
on thinking of doing some of that someday?
Yeah. So book one. Yeah. So if I were to do book one of the Levi Yoder series again, I may have done it a little differently, but obviously it is what it is. So I actually have an element of the Levi Yoder series where I tied it off at the end saying, I'm never going back to this.
Okay.
I don't want to know anything about it. I don't want to, because there was some, like for instance, his cancer remission was somewhat, let's call it supernatural, if nothing
Yeah.
else.
Yeah.
And it was one of those things where he learned about it, it made no sense to him, and
hmm
and it gave him the willies, and he's like, I'm tearing all this up. That this isn't who I am. That's not, I am who I am. You're not telling me anything differently, because
hmm
the implication of that was he's got some larger role. So the
Yeah.
answer to your question is maybe.
Yeah. All right.
I might
All
come
right.
back.
Well, yeah, we can leave it at that. But
Yeah,
all right, Mike, I really appreciate the time and it's great getting some insight into your, your writing and just your world a little bit. And I know you're a very busy guy, so I'm so thankful that you're able to take some time out and be with us here today
sure.
and hopefully you enjoyed it as well. So
Yeah, it was fun.
yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. All right. Well, we'll be publishing this as soon as we can, and I wish you nothing but the best of luck with your new book. That should be out in February as well.
Yeah, good
Thank you
luck
very
with the
much, Mike.
podcast. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
All right. And Mike has left the building, so I can't thank Mike enough for coming on the podcast to talk about his writing, about his books, balancing career and family. And I guess that's one of the important things that I really like to get out of having him on here was just an understanding of what it's taken for him to go from unpublished author to USA Today bestseller list and beyond, and still be able to balance family and work. And you can obviously tell it may not be easy, and COVID doesn't definitely help with that, or definitely doesn't help with that. But he's making it work, and so I think we can all do that and work to really balance our time. I think we didn't dig into family life for Mike a whole lot as far as interaction with his wife and things like that, but I think you can tell that he is a family oriented guy. You can tell from his opinions. He's got strong opinions on things, but he's also someone that I think has a strong sense of value and a good moral compass, and is someone that would, if he was a friend of yours, would bend over backwards if you needed him to help you out. I have loved reading his books. I mentioned a bunch of them in the over the course of the discussion that we had, so I highly recommend picking all of them up on on either Kindle or paperback, whatever your medium is of choice. They're all excellent reads, and I didn't get a chance to compliment him on his dialogue, but I think one thing he does well, in addition to bringing the science aspects into his books, is that he does a really good job writing dialogue, and I think that's something that people can tend to not pay enough attention to, as far as how does it sound right when two people are talking to each other in a story, and are the words that they're saying, or the way that they're saying them, the way they're being portrayed, the scenario, the setting, is all of that being brought together into one cohesive wholeness. So I think he does a really good job with that. One challenge, I guess my challenge for the week this week is, can you find a new author to read? I'd recommend Mike's book if you're a fan of science or fiction, or tying those all together into a cohesive novel. Take a read at them. Just get a sample and go from there and see what you think. But if you're also taking a look at stretching your goals, stretching yourself a little bit, take a listen to the podcast, and see what you can do to take things to the next step for yourself. How can you take that next step as with your activities, with your family, with yourself, and really be more present in the things that you do from day to day. For Grow to Amazing, this is Tony Mays, so we'll see you next week.